Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. How's everyone doing? Welcome to Darwinian Delusions, How to Understand Islam and the Science of Evolution. As you guys know, from anybody who's attended my previous webinars or videos or talks or whatever, I like to keep things as interactive as possible. So we're going to be doing this session, and during the session, any questions that I see in the chat, I'll try and answer them there and then we'll have an extensive Q&A, inshallah, in which we go over these things in more detail. So I'm sure you guys are familiar, those of you who have attended the previous webinars, on how to use the chat and how to use the questions. My suggestion would be during the actual session, just use the chat, and questions, just start putting your questions through when we are at the Q&A section. Okay, Bismillah, let's begin. So what's this about? Darwinian delusions. Okay, so the name, you may be thinking delusions and Darwinian, like where did this name come from? Well, you got the God Delusion book, right? You got Richard Dawkins going on about how evolution undermines the existence of God, and why various arguments for God don't make any sense, and God is basically a delusion. So it's just a spin on that, and it's a bit of a focus on Darwinism, because Darwinism is like the Genesis story that atheists use to try and justify their worldview. So let's begin. So what we're going to be covering today is this. We're going to be doing a quick sort of review of the Philosophy of Science webinar, which was held a few weeks ago, I believe. And that obviously dovetails into this topic quite nicely, because that sets the framework within which we look at any scientific theory. Whether you're a Muslim, Christian, Jewish person, or atheist, whoever you are, it's important to understand the philosophy of science. We're going to cover evolution and Darwinism. What is Darwinism about? Is it absolutely true? Is it beyond doubt? Has it undermined the existence of God? Or is it actually the case that, no, it's a valid scientific theory, doesn't mean it's true literally, however, it's based on a probabilistic framework which has assumptions and there's disputes about its core mechanism. On top of that, there's nothing about Darwinian theory that undermines the existence of God. What do I mean by that? Actually, let's leave that for later, because you may be wondering, hang on a second, surely Darwinism does undermine God, and that is true. It does from one perspective. What I actually mean by this is that as a purely scientific theory, is it an argument against God? No. Is there a perception that this argument is used against God? Yeah. And then we're going to be covering something about Islam and evolution. Let me just open up the chat section to see what's going on. No one's putting in any comments in the chat section. Normally, those are coming in quite a lot. Maybe everyone's just in the Q&A section. All right, so quick overview of the Philosophy of Science webinar that was held a few weeks ago. Science is held up as an ultimate truth. Science is held up as an alternative to God. Science is deified. In the olden days, people used to worship Lat, Uzza, Manat, these idols. And even today, people worship physical idols in India, in other parts of the world. And then you get an atheist who's like, oh, look at these primitive people worshiping idols, right? We don't worship idols. We don't worship anything. We don't believe in any of that. What we believe in is science, right? Well, the universe is basically a gigantic idol. It's just a gigantic Uzza for the atheist, because when you have the Quraysh who are going and saying, oh, to Lat or Uzza or Manat, and trying to think that this thing governs their life and impacts their destiny. Well, it's the same thing with the atheist. They think the universe created us. The universe is us, and they have this sort of deification of the universe. And how do they worship the universe? Well, they've made science, which is supposed to be a wonderful tool, into a weapon against religion, against God, and as a tool to worship the universe. And of course, none of this approach actually makes any sense whatsoever, because what we got to understand is that science is not there to give you a worldview. Science is simply there for us to try and attempt to see how the world actually works. Okay, I'm just reading some of the comments that are coming in. And I think some of the comments are, we're going to be dealing with that later. So Sister Selma is asking, in what aspect do Islamic thought and the Darwinian theory conflict? We'll be delving into that later, inshallah. Okay, so this idea that science is the be-all and end-all, the philosophy of science challenges that. It challenges the fact that, well, it doesn't challenge the fact that it challenges the perception that science gives you certainty, and it challenges the perception that science is the only way of looking at the world, right? There's multiple ways of gaining knowledge about the world, including testimony, mathematics, logic, introspection. However, science is one way of gaining knowledge about the world. So science does not lead to certainty, and it can change. This is an extremely important point to understand. Why does science not lead to certainty? Well, simply because of the way the scientific method or the scientific methods work. So you have a scientist who's trying to work out what color are swans, and then he or she goes out and tries to discover the color of swans and discovers actually swans are white. And they see 1,000 swans, they say, yep, they're white. Then over time, they look at another 1,000, then they say, yep, those are white. In all, they get 1,000,000 swans and they see they're white, and then they say, from this limited set of data, we make the unlimited conclusion, all swans are white. That doesn't obviously lead to certainty, because one day you can come across a black swan. So the black swan problem, or the problem of induction raised, by David Hume and others, is something that's not been resolved. So science doesn't lead to certainty from that perspective. Another thing to keep in mind is the problem of underdetermination, which is the same scientific data can give rise to alternative theories. And a third thing to consider is the problem of unconceived alternatives, which is there may be solutions in front of you that the data supports, but we simply cannot see them because they are unconceived. Another point to keep in mind, just because a scientific theory works doesn't mean it's absolutely true. So Newtonian mechanics, it works, but does that mean the assumptions in Newtonian mechanics that time and space is fixed, that's true? Well, actually, we have a conflict now, because general relativity, which has replaced Newtonian mechanics, actually says time and space is no longer fixed. It's actually flexible like fabric. So it doesn't matter if a scientific theory works, it doesn't mean it's true. And science, of course, doesn't lead to atheism. And I say, of course, an atheist, a new atheist, a militant atheist would say, no, it actually does. So what we can simply do is we can say science is a way of trying to understand how the world works, but it's not there to replace God. It doesn't negate the existence of God, and it's not something which can ever negate the existence of God. This is just a pure misconception, and this is confusing philosophical and methodological naturalism. Now you may be wondering, what on God's good earth is philosophical and methodological naturalism? Well, in short, philosophical naturalism is the idea that there is nothing except nature. Everything in all reality can be broken down to matter and processes, right? Everything can be broken down to that. Everything can be explained naturalistically. So that's philosophical naturalism. Philosophical naturalism is, of course, held by atheists. Atheists generally, not always, but generally are philosophical naturalists. They believe the universe has no creator, there's no supernatural being, there's no angels, there's no mind, there's no objective morals, no consciousness. Essentially, everything is just the brain at work. And that, of course, is not something which Muslims believe. We believe in the divine, we believe in God, we believe in angels, we believe in jinn, we believe in the mind, we believe in these things which are beyond the natural. Methodological naturalism, what is that? Well, methodological naturalism is not a belief system, it's a method. Philosophical naturalism is a belief system. Methodological naturalism is a method, which is when we are doing science in particular, we are going to use natural causes and effects. We're not going to refer to divine intervention, a mind, consciousness, angels, jinn, God, anything like that, nothing. We will just stick to what we can observe, what is measurable, testable, cause and effect, physical reality. Now, what's interesting is that a Muslim, a Christian, a Jewish person, or someone who believes in God, they obviously cannot be a philosophical naturalist. But in terms of science, in terms of working within the scientific lab, the scientific research facility, whatever, they can be a methodological naturalist. They can simply say, well, methodological naturalism's something I subscribe to, and they can just carry on with that. Okay. So everything I'm going to be mentioning today is not going to be anything except that you will find it within mainstream secular naturalism, well, within the naturalistic framework, right? So you'll find naturalists talking about this, you'll find secularists talking about this, you'll find these sorts of things in peer-reviewed journals. Any scientist that I refer to is going to be somebody who's a mainstream scientist. Okay, so what I'm mentioning today is not from, say, people who are anti-Darwinism, right? This is just mainstream stuff. First thing to understand, Darwinian evolution is a valid scientific theory, model, and paradigm. Usually when I say this, the first reaction Muslims have is, are you saying it's true? And the answer to that obviously is no. When Darwinian evolution is called science or a valid scientific theory, model, paradigm, it simply means that Darwinian evolution is science. That's what it means. It doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean that it's unchangeable. It doesn't mean any of those things. Why this misconception exists is because there's a perception that if something's science, then it must be true. And this is scientism. This is this idea that, you know, science is the only root of knowledge, science gives you certainty, science leads to atheism, you know, this type of thinking, this quasi-scientism type of idea. Something being a valid scientific model doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It just means it's a valid scientific model. For example, 100 years ago, Newtonian mechanics was a valid scientific model theory paradigm. It was science. Time and space being fixed was science. Today, we know that time and space, according to our best understanding, is not fixed. So a valid scientific theory doesn't mean true. It just means it's a valid scientific theory. I hope this is clear, because usually when it comes down to this point about science, and this is why we cover the philosophy of science before we do the science, this is something that if you misunderstand now, then the rest of this talk is going to be difficult for you to grasp. So you really need to understand science doesn't mean true. It just simply means something is scientific. And interestingly enough, the people who push out Darwinism as a replacement for God, the likes of Richard Dawkins, and the people who push out this type of scientism and this type of certainty about science, at the same time, in their lesser known writings, they recognize the philosophy of science. They recognize the limits of science, the presuppositions of science, and how science isn't the be all and end all. It's not the gospel truth. we must acknowledge the possibility that new facts may come to light, which will force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism and modify it beyond recognition. That sounds like something a militant creationist would say, right? Or the sort of thing you'd find in a creationist literature being handed out in Speaker's Corner or whatever, right? No, this is found in Richard Dawkins' book, A Devil's Chaplain, and I recommend you read this chapter and you read this particular, it's called Universal Darwinism, right? You read this section just to make sure, if you're in any doubt, that this isn't taken out of context. In fact, there's more, there's an amplification of this point when you read it within context. What's he saying? He's saying new facts may come to light which will force us to basically abandon Darwinism or modify beyond recognition, meaning what? The problem of induction, essentially, philosophy of science, essentially. So what is being said here does not mean Richard Dawkins doubts Darwinian evolution. Rather, it simply means he understands the limitations of science. Additionally, Charles Darwin, whose view, by the way, is way better than Richard Dawkins, way better than Richard Dawkins when it comes to evolution, he actually acknowledges a similar point from philosophy of science. He acknowledges the point which I referred to earlier, known as the problem of underdetermination, which is essentially that the same data can give rise to alternative theories. In the beginning of The Origin of Species, this is what he says. I am well aware that there is scarcely a single point discussed in this volume, meaning The Origin of Species, on which facts cannot be adduced, often apparently leading to conclusions directly opposite to those which have arrived. A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts on both sides of each question, and this possibly cannot be done here. Very interesting. What's he saying? He's saying, whatever I've written in my Origin of Species, I'm fully aware somebody can use my evidence, my data, to arrive at a theory other than mine. That's what he's saying. And that's amazing if you think about it, right? That shows how Darwin was a lot better than these neo-Darwinists, because he understood that essentially the philosophy of science teaches us the same data can give rise to alternative theories. And Darwinists today would simply say Darwinism is the only game in town. Clearly, conceptually, philosophically, that cannot be the point. It's impossible that one scientific theory can cover all of the data in a way that a rival theory cannot also encompass it in a way and also be empirically equivalent. You can't have something that's also very similar, right, in terms of explanatory power. Why is that not possible? Conceptually, that works on every scientific theory. Then why on earth would it not work with Darwinian evolution? Why is Darwinism an exception? Why are we doing a webinar on Darwinism and not string theory, right? Or how string theory leads to atheism? There's something clearly about this theory, and we're going to cover that near the end, that you'll see that, you know, this isn't just a scientific theory, it's more than that. All right, let me just quickly go to the chat and see if there's any questions or comments. Okay. Science does not claim to be absolute truth. It claims to be the best understanding based from the evidence we have. The changing nature of science is core in the scientific method. Absolutely. That's written by Usman Hussain. Totally agree with that comment. Right, next. So we have evolution and Darwinism, two different things. Now you may be thinking, wait a minute, evolution is Darwinism. Darwinism is evolution. You know, Darwin's theory of evolution. It's all just one and the same. It's like saying, I don't know, what's a good example? It's like saying Islam and Muslims, right? It's just synonymous, right? It's just one thing. Why separate the two? See, this is important to separate the two simply to show that evolution existed before Darwin, and evolution is something different to Darwin, and evolution can be defined in many different ways, which can be very confusing, even academically. Even academics fall into this, that you really have to do this academic sort of throat clearing before you speak about this topic, because people mean different things when they say evolution. Okay, so let's go over this. The general idea of biological change over time. Just the general idea of biological change over time. This idea is evolution. Things change over time, they evolve. Species gain traits, lose traits, you end up with vestigial organs, you have new organs, you adapt to the environment. Evolution as a general idea has been known, written, and philosophized about for thousands of years. This sounds incredible, and it is actually. You can go back to the ancient Indus Valley civilization, the Babylonians, Egyptians, Chinese, whoever, and you will find, and of course, not to forget the Greeks, right? You will find people speaking about biological evolution. That's very clear. However, biological evolution is something that was discussed and known about, and people got involved in these type of discussions. Later on, a French scientist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he put together, about 50 years before Darwin, he put together a particular type of evolutionary theory known as Lamarckian evolution. And that theory was that life has many different origins, and you have parallel lines of evolution taking place, and the mechanism is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, you may be thinking, what on earth is that? Like, what does that mean? Look, this is not a biology class, but all you guys need to remember is it's a mechanism, right? Lamarckian evolution has a mechanism, and it has a history. It has two distinct elements. It has a history and a mechanism. The history is the hedge of life, multiple different origins of life, parallel lines of evolution taking place, and then the mechanism is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Some 50 years after Jean-Baptiste Lamarck comes along Darwin. Darwin comes up with an alternative to the Lamarckian evolution, which we today call Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution is not multiple origins, it's one origin. Luca, last universal common ancestor. And from this one origin, you get all of the billions of species that have ever lived. So everything, a blade of grass, a coconut, a pineapple, Homo sapien, and Ricky Gervais, right? Everything going back has a last universal common ancestor. And that last universal common ancestor was essentially a cell of some sort, and it existed approximately 4 billion years ago. How did this happen? This is extremely important, guys, what I'm about to say right now. How did a cell evolve over billions of years into elephants, giraffes, gorillas, monkeys, and celebrities? Through a mechanism. And that mechanism is called natural selection. Natural selection. So you have the tree of life, which means one single origin, many different things branching out. You get the tree of life, and all of this drive of life, drive of diversity, and this massive evolutionary change, it happens because of natural selection. Why am I emphasizing that point? The reason why I'm emphasizing that point is because natural selection is the core of Darwinism. Even the tree of life idea, it did exist before Darwin. Some, like Lamarck, they said, hedge of life, multiple origins. Darwin said tree of life, but even people before him, they said tree of life. And the tree of life is based upon the idea, things which are similar, put them into one compartment, they have a common ancestor, going back, there's one origin, right? But none of this story of the tree of life was going to make any sense unless you have a mechanism. And Darwin proposed natural selection, and natural selection is the core of Darwinism, and it's natural selection that has to be dismantled if you want to show that Darwinism isn't all that it's cut out to be. This is very important because a lot of people get hung up on, hey, look, isn't it that this species is similar to this species in anatomy or in genetics? You got human and chimps, which are 99% similar. How they calculate 99 is another matter, but say you got that, or we're 50% with bananas or whatever. No, it's natural selection. It's natural selection that we need to challenge, and it's natural selection that they need to verify in order for the tree of life to make sense. It's not enough to simply say things are similar. We knew things were similar before Darwin. In fact, taxonomy today, how they classify species into different genres, that is something that Linnaeus came up with, and that's more than 100 years before Darwin. So the Linnaean classification system, which we still use today, is pre-Darwinian. What gives it life, the idea of the tree of life, is natural selection. So it's natural selection. This is very important because whenever we are arguing with Darwinists, they always run away to similarities. Well, guess what? Darwinian theory is not a theory of similarity. Darwinian theory is a theory of transformation. And that transformation happens through natural selection. I've been, alhamdulillah, last couple of years debating Darwinists, right? Sometimes people with formal qualifications like PhDs, sometimes, you know, people who should be sitting on park benches with tinfoil hats like Aaron Ra. Whoever it is, essentially they're going to make the same argument. The Darwinists are going to say, look, these two things are similar, therefore Darwinism's true. If that's the case, pick up the origin of species and throw it in the bin. What is the origin of species about? Natural selection. Therefore, it's natural selection that we need to challenge in order to show Darwinism isn't all that is cut out to be. All right, guys, very important point I'm about to mention here. It's not as important as, you know, I've been saying this is an important point, that's an important point. I'm sure some of you want to throw me out the window right now. However, this is a very interesting and novel point which people sometimes within the discourse of evolutionary discussions overlook, okay? And it's a very interesting conceptual point. Remember I spoke about methodological naturalism. Who remembers methodological naturalism? Methodological naturalism is the idea that causation is only physical, right? When we're studying science. That's not the same as philosophical naturalism, which says that cause and effect and physical reality is all that there is, physical matter and processes. Nothing else exists in the universe, okay? So what we got to realize is this. It is impossible for us to have a discussion about evolutionary theory without looking at methodological naturalism, because methodological naturalism is an assumption, it's not a conclusion, and that assumption colors all of the data, and it leads to three distinct conclusions. A priori, meaning before we look at the evidence, before we do any of the science, because of the assumption of methodological naturalism, there is no design, no independent ancestry, and there is a naturalistic purpose. Okay, Shabazz Khan has asked an interesting question. Does common ancestry contradict with the creation of Adam and Hawa alayhi salam? As to my knowledge, animals and Adam and Hawa, peace be upon them, were created separately. So how do they share common ancestry? Okay. Common ancestry the idea that all of life has a common ancestor, going back to the last universal common ancestor, does this contradict the creation of Adam alayhi salam? Let me repeat the question. If the science is certain, if the science is 100% true, so someone's not saying it's a valid scientific theory, someone's literally saying this is the truth, right? It is true that animals and all of life, all plants, all bacteria, everything goes back to a last universal common ancestor. If someone says this is true and then says, does it contradict the Quran if I hold this to be true? The answer is yes, there is a contradiction. Why? Because the creation of Adam alayhi salam is a miracle. From the Islamic conception, Adam alayhi salam has no ancestors. Adam alayhi salam does not have a forerunner. Adam alayhi salam is a miracle in the same way Isa alayhi salam is a miracle. This is very important to understand. So not only is it that Allah says the likeness of Adam is like that of Isa, Allah also says that he created our mother Hawa alayhi salam from the rib of Adam alayhi salam. No reproduction was involved there, nothing to do with evolution. That was another miracle. Now, the idea that this does not contradict the Quran, that we can somehow merge this with the Quran, maybe we can say this, maybe we can say that, maybe something else happened, right? Very simple answer. For any of you guys who've been following the work that I've been putting out for the last couple of years, you would have known by now that how this sort of approach began is 2013, when Hamza Sotsis wrote this paper, which was about evolution and certainty, right? And the basis of the paper was that what's the point of trying to take the Quran and take biological evolution, take Darwinism, and see where they correlate or where they contradict, when all we simply need to do is use the basic philosophy of science to understand science doesn't give you certainty. We do an epistemic weight. We look at the fact that the Quran is true and is absolutely true because we have evidence for it. Science is ilm al-dhann, it's the knowledge of speculation, so there's no contest. If there is so if scientists are having a discussion about what is the cause of something, or how did this thing, and say the Quran is silent on that. The Quran and the Sunnah is silent on that. So I don't know, they have a particular idea about pine trees do a particular type of communication with other trees, right? They have a theory about how this happened, or what's the mechanism behind this, or what's the purpose behind it, whatever it is. They have some thing, or about string theory, 11 dimensions, whatever it is. Something that the Quran and the Sunnah is silent about. As a Muslim, you can say, perhaps this is true. Perhaps this is true. You can say that. However, when you have something which clearly contradicts the Quran, it doesn't matter if all of the scientists get together in the world and they say, this is our conclusion, it's not going to change, and this is an absolute fact. It doesn't matter what they think. If that thing contradicts the Quran, we will never take the science over the Quran. I'll give you an example. How are babies formed? How does this creation of a child happen? Well, I'm assuming everyone here is over 18. So, the whole thing about the birds and the bees, I'm sure you've been through that story. Essentially, you have reproduction. You have a male, you have a female, you have intimacy, then you have a 9-month roughly process of development. Then you have delivery, boom, you got a child. It's not that easy, but you know, that's what happens. How does that happen? We've seen time and time and time and time again, it happens via physical causation between a male and a female. Yet Allah the Most High has told us, Maryam alayhi salam gave birth to Isa alayhi salam without any male intervention. Go to a science conference. Go listen to a bunch of scientists who are sitting around a table and discussing science. Go there and say, guys, assuming they're not all guys, say guys and women and everybody, right? So tell me, is it possible that a woman gives birth without having any interaction with a man, without IVF, without any physical interaction with semen? Can a woman give birth to a child? They will all laugh at you. They will all laugh at you. They will think you are insane for even asking that question. No, we are not insane. But alhamdulillah, we have iman, and our iman is stronger than your laughter. Our iman is stronger than your scientific consensus. Our iman is stronger than the limited lenses that you look at the world, that you think everything is physical. Reality for us doesn't consist of cause and effect, of atoms in motion. Reality for us is Allah and what Allah created and what Allah can do, because Allah set the laws of motion. Allah set the uniformity of nature. Allah says kun fayakun, and He can do whatever He wills. So we're not in the game of having a discussion with you about whether the virgin birth makes sense or not, because the virgin birth is true despite what your limited minds are telling you. Why? Because we have evidence. What's the evidence? We have proof that the Quran is the word of Allah, and if Allah says He created a man and a woman and He brought them together and they had a child, we say we believe. If Allah, the same Allah, says, I created a woman, from the woman alone I created another child without any male intervention, we say we believe. It makes no difference whether it's a natural, what we call natural birth, or whether it's what people today would consider unnatural or supernatural, which is a virgin birth. For us, both of these are just as easy for Allah, because Allah simply says kun fayakun. Okay, so what we got to realize is this: it is very important for us to look at the paradigm from which science is operating. So let's look into this particular example which I was giving earlier. The limitation of methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism, because there is no God, because there is nothing supernatural, then there is no biological design. Design is an illusion of design. That's a necessary conclusion from the assumption of methodological naturalism. That is something you cannot avoid. That's impossible to avoid. Secondly, no independent ancestry. You cannot have independent ancestry. Why? Oh, human beings appeared in the history of life without being linked to something else. That's impossible from a scientific perspective, because everything has to be explained naturalistically. Okay? Lastly, naturalistic purpose. Like Richard Dawkins says in Selfish Gene, the highest rationale is survival and reproduction. So this idea that we were created for the worship of a being, a transcendent creator, a divine lawgiver, this is not something which methodological naturalism would permit. So no design. Francis Crick puts it in a very nice way. Biologists must constantly keep in mind what they see was not designed but rather evolved. Keep this in mind. This is not a conclusion. Francis Crick is not saying we have concluded and we've looked at the data and we've decided with a hypothesis of design and a hypothesis of no design, and we've now come to conclusion there's no design. Rather, he is echoing methodological naturalism. By default, there is no design. Why? Because there is no God according to methodological naturalism in terms of science. When you're talking, a methodological naturalist outside of science, they can believe in God. However, within the scientific discourse, they have to pretend as if there is absolutely nothing supernatural. No separate ancestry. It's not possible to have separate ancestry. Okay? Before we look at what Gareth Nelson says about this, I want you to consider something. Earlier on, and by the way, the example of Isa alayhi salam and Adam alayhi salam is very interesting. And the reason why it's very interesting is because when Allah gives us examples, those examples have multiple layers of meanings, and those examples are timeless. And you know, Allahu Akbar, when you think about the verse of the Quran which Allah says the likeness of Adam is like Isa, there's so many ways you can speak about it. It's not only in creation, it's not only in our belief as Muslims that we believe in Adam and Isa, it's also in the disbelief in Adam and disbelief in Isa. Of course, we Muslims don't disbelieve, but this is for the disbelievers. Interestingly, most atheists in the world are not atheists from a Hindu background or Buddhist background or Muslim background or Shinto background. They're atheists from a Christian background. And who do they deny? Isa alayhi salam. They deny Jesus. Not only do they deny his divinity, we also deny the divinity, but they also deny his messengership, that he was sent by God. On top of that, they also deny his existence. They doubt it. Did he really do those things? Was he born of a in terms of his virgin birth? No way. They will never accept it. Interestingly, those same atheists, their Genesis story, which is Darwinism, also makes them deny Adam alayhi salam. So they deny Isa and Adam alayhi salam, just like we believe in Isa and Adam alayhi salam. So it's quite interesting how both those figures are linked from a disbelief point of view. Also, consider this. Imagine, remember I gave the example earlier of those scientists who are sitting around and they are, laughing at the idea of a virgin birth. Okay, say those scientists, we all take them and we take them to 2020 years ago, roughly around the time that Isa alayhi salam was walking around giving his dawah to Bani Israel. And we go to the Middle East, we go to Bethlehem, we go to Jerusalem, we go to the Holy Lands, and we go there. And we, using our technology, we freeze the entire village where Isa alayhi salam is preaching. And we get these scientists to take all of the frozen people in the village in which Isa alayhi salam is there, and to take out the DNA of everybody. And we tell them, build up a family tree. Who's linked to who? They will take out everybody's DNA, and then they'll start saying he's related to this person's related to that person's related to that. When they go to Isa alayhi salam and they take out his DNA, what are they going to say? They're going to look at other people's DNA, they're going to see Maryam alayhi salam's DNA, and they're going to say, who's the mother? Maryam alayhi salam, because there's homology. Not homology, there's a synergy, right, in terms of the sequence. Likewise, when it comes to the father, we as Muslims believe and know with absolute certainty that Isa alayhi salam had no father. But they, because they're limited by methodological naturalism and they don't believe in God and they cannot accept virgin birth a priori, they will look at a male member of Maryam alayhi salam's family, look at the DNA sequence, look okay, my God, this matches, right? This matches Isa alayhi salam, and they will label person X the father, even though we know that's not the father. We know with certainty that's not the father, because of methodological naturalism. Likewise, the Darwinists, they have to link human beings to something else in nature. Well, why not just link them to something that looks similar to us? In this case, chimpanzees. So that's how they come up with it. Now, Gareth Nelson, he has an interesting quotation in this regard. We've got to have some ancestors. We'll pick those. So he's speaking about human beings have to have ancestors, and we'll pick those, whichever hominids they are, right? Or Lucy or whatever, Homo naledi or whatever, right? We've got to have some ancestors. We'll pick those. Why? Because we know they have to be there. And these are the best candidates. That's by and large it has worked. I'm not exaggerating. He's talking about the way that genealogy works in terms of coming up with hominid species who are supposed to be forerunners to human beings. That's how it works. But what we need to do is we need to move the discussion away from purely similarity to the discussion about transformation. Because even if you, and there's an interesting video which I'm going to be releasing inshallah tomorrow on Darwinian Delusions YouTube channel, in which there is a Muslim brother who is speaking to a atheist evolutionary professor, and the evolutionary professor takes out some skulls and says, this thing is similar to this thing, they were all found in the same valley, therefore they all have a common ancestor. And that Muslim brother, he simply says, how do you know? Natural selection did that. That's all he asks him. How do you know natural selection did that? So the Muslim brother didn't fall into the trap of saying, aha, it's not homology, or it's this, or it's that. All he simply did is he asked the right question. How do you know natural selection did that? And this evolutionary professor lost it. His body language, his tone, his manner of speaking, he knew he just got exposed. Because all they want to do, all the Darwinists want to do, is stick the conversation to what is similar and what is similar and what is similar. Well, guess what? Darwinism is not about similarity. Darwinism is about transformation. Okay. Question by Samama Fahim. Can we ever see science as rendering God unnecessary, if not proving that God does not exist? What would you say that entails? I mentioned this in the beginning. If you missed that part, listen to that part again, or last time's webinar. I don't want to cover it again because of time, but in short, the answer to that is no. Okay. In other words, again, talking about methodological naturalism, the atheist biologist from Harvard, Richard Lewontin, says this: we are forced by our a priori, meaning before evidence, adherence to material causes, to create an apparatus of investigation and set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow divine foot in the door. So guys, what's he talking about here? What is he talking about? He is talking about methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism, and how the limits on science force scientists to accept certain conclusions and reject others. As a thought experiment, this is not the way biological evolution works. This is not at all a representation of Darwinian evolution. However, this is at least coherent from a scientific perspective if someone was to put together a hypothesis that human beings and chimps have a common, human beings and pigs are the forerunners of human beings, and human beings are a hybrid between pigs and chimps. There is almost nobody in the world that believes this. I mean, there is a scientist, Eugene McCarthy. He's big on this, right? He really believes this is true. He has a few followers, but it's literally hardly anybody, right, who believes this stuff. However, the idea that Allah created Adam without any forerunners, or Isa without a father, those things are scientifically impossible because of methodological naturalism, but something as bizarre as this is still scientific. Even if it's not accepted by scientists ultimately because of their other presuppositions, still it is scientifically a hypothesis. It's not classified as outside the realm of science because it's naturalistic. It's naturalistic, right? So this shows you the implications of the methodological naturalism. All right. Now, as you guys, for those of you who have attended other similar talks or lectures and stuff like that, you guys would have realized that I spent a long time of this particular webinar focusing on the presuppositions, the limits, the implications of the assumption of methodological naturalism. Why? Because I come to realize, usually when I started speaking about evolution a few years ago, I would go straight to probabilistic framework, assumptions, and disputes. But the problem is, these things still are colored by methodological naturalism. So ultimately, if you understand philosophy of science, you know that Darwinism is not a problem. But even if you just understand methodological naturalism, you then also understand it's not a problem. But additionally, we've got a problem with PAD. We've got a problem with the idea that Darwinism is certain. Absolutely true, because there's no way of getting around this. Darwinian evolution, according to mainstream secular biologists, is based on a probabilistic framework. That's impossible to escape. It has assumptions. That's impossible to escape. And there are disputes about its core ideas. That's impossible to escape as well. And we're going to be covering this briefly. Probabilistic framework. The way that one science journal mentions it in terms of evolutionary anthropology is, it's like, you know, the book War and Peace, which is humongous. You know, you could probably use it as a weapon, throw it at somebody. Not endorsing violence here, but you know, it's a big book. Anyway, work out the plot with 13 randomly selected pages. Imagine you were given this book, right? And all of the pages were blank. Only 13 randomly selected pages had ink on them and stories on them and writings and characters and plots. And you're told, work out the rest of the story using these 13 pages. There are 113 people on this webinar. If I gave, one guy just dropped off, so it's 112 now. Anyway, if I just gave 112 people this book and they had 13 randomly selected pages, they would come up with their own plots, right? One of the plots would involve this character died, that character died. I'm sure one of the plots is going to involve, you know, jinn. Like, people come up with their own stuff, right? Whatever they want. And this is what we got to realize, that from the history of life perspective, 99.999% of the data is missing. It's missing. That doesn't mean it's missing from the perspective that we know of a species and we know that different organisms don't exist anymore because they've just been fossilized or they died out or whatever it is. No, 99.999% of species on Earth, whoever lived amongst the billions that have supposedly lived, we do not have their fossils, we don't have their DNA, we don't have their cave drawings. We have nothing. So how can someone be like, yeah, we worked it out, we know what's going on? It's a very incredibly outrageous claim to try and claim certainty with that much data missing. So look, it's a scatter graph on steroids. You know, you're trying to work out a scatter graph, right? What's the best line of fit? But it's like a three-dimensional scatter graph. You can come up with the universal common ancestry or the hedge of life or the web of life or gradualism or rapid change or progression or non-progression. Whatever you make is bound to be probabilistic, it's bound to be open to interpretations, but of course scientists have to stick to one story at a time. That's just the way that science works. Also, it's important to understand, you know, when we're told stories, how did this thing evolve? It evolved like that. How did that thing evolve? It evolved via this mechanism, by this particular thing. Even atheist academics recognize these are stories without empirical basis. Coherent stories nonetheless, but coherent stories doesn't equal truth. Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould, they famously wrote a paper about this particular idea in the 70s, I believe, and it popularized the idea of just so stories from Rudyard Kipling's children's book. That's the name that's now become an academic term, just so stories. And those just so stories are things like, you know, the crocodile grabbing onto the elephant, dragging it into the water. That's how it's got a long trunk and all of that. And these stories are empirically coherent, but empirically baseless. There's no evidence that's how an elephant's trunk was elongated, right? Likewise, all of these stories that Darwinists come up with, these are stories which may be coherent and may be consistent with natural selection, but empirically they are lacking evidence. Raymond Tallis, he's somebody who highlights this sort of thing. He mentioned this about color evolution, how, you know, there was this theory about why men like the color blue, women like the color red. Anyway, he showed it to be nonsense, right? And so they'll come up with all these elaborate stories, but even atheist academics will be picking holes in them. All right. Now we come to the idea of homology and homoplasy. Homology is, well, before homology, you just used to mean similarities in structure and function. After Darwin, the definition changed to a bit of a circular one, which is similarities due to common ancestry. So, hey, look at this skull, look at that skull, therefore they're similar, therefore they have a common ancestor. Look at this DNA sequence, look at this DNA sequence, they're similar, therefore they have a common ancestor. Firstly, guys, here's the important point. We know similarities genetically, anatomically, linguistically, psychologically, which are not due to common ancestry. That's known as homoplasy. But even if someone says these similarities are due to common ancestry, at best that's an assumption. At best that's an assumption. And if you try and make that assumption into a conclusion, you can't do that except via circular reasoning. Similarities are due to common ancestry. That's your first premise. That's homology. That's the definition of homology. Hey, look, two similarities exist on a DNA level or on an anatomical level, linguistic level. Therefore, common ancestry. Well done. Circular reasoning. If you want to say homology is an assumption, bismillah, no problem. But if you want to say homology is a conclusion, you can't do that except via using circular reasoning. Now, there's a philosopher of biology, Ronald Brady, and you know, he argues about this type of thing where dogmatic endeavors are being used to basically come up with certain conclusions, right? He says by making, and he's talking about homology here, by making our explanation to the definition of the condition to be explained, we express not scientific hypothesis, but belief. We are so convinced that our explanation is true that we no longer see any need to distinguish it from the situation we're trying to explain. Dogmatic endeavors like this must eventually leave the realm of science. So it's a quagmire from the perspective that, hey, look, bats and birds, they both have wings, they must have common ancestors. No, even according to Darwinists, that was an independent evolution. Hey, look, echolocation and the genetic data for echolocation in bats and dolphins is similar. They have a common ancestor. No, again, that's homoplasy. That's not got to do with homology. So this is important to understand, that ultimately it's all based on a probabilistic framework, and they have to make assumptions about the data in order for them to go forward, right? So, you know, these very simplistic ideas, humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they're so similar. Humans and mushrooms must be raised independently because they're so different. This is something which is called naive, even by atheist academics. And there's assumptions, right? There's assumptions which are hard to ignore. Interestingly, Darwin spoke about these types of assumptions in his book, The Origin of Species. And interestingly, in chapter 6 also, he mentions difficulties with his theory and difficulties with also his assumptions. So you got the assumption of gradualism, you got the assumption that all life goes back to a single source, and that, well, it's a neo-Darwinian assumption of the selfish gene, that natural selection works at a genetic level. By the way, guys, sometimes when I'm going off into this biology stuff, don't worry about it. All you need to understand, if you don't understand the biology, if you understand the biology, that's good. If you don't understand it, just understand there's assumptions involved, and these assumptions are questionable. So gradualism is something which Darwin thought, if this assumption breaks down, my theory will break down. Gradualism, guess what? It was challenged, and it has been challenged from the time of Darwin, but especially since the 70s with punctuated equilibrium and all these alternatives. So gradualism is something which can easily be shown not to be true. However, it doesn't mean Darwinism is false, because they simply changed the assumptions and they fixed Darwinism and they carried on. Why? Because methodological naturalism doesn't allow them to bring in something else. So Darwinism is the best bet they have, simply because it explains the data in a naturalistic way. Tree of life, again, that assumption is being replaced by some people when they speak about the web of life. Here you have Craig Venter and Ford Doolittle, and they also speak about the same thing, about the tree of life not being represented by a tree. And both of these are atheists, by the way, these scientists. And again, about selfishness, right? That human beings, ultimately, we are survival machines, selfish machines out there to basically, ultimately, even the good actions we do, we're looking for something in return. So they try and come up with these theories of kin selection, which is, oh, we're being nice to our kin because they carry our genes, or we're being nice to strangers, reciprocal altruism, because they're going to give us something back. All of these things are, after the fact, ad hoc ways of reverse engineering clear facts which go against Darwinism. And I love what the atheist philosopher David Stove says about Darwinism. He says it's a slander upon the human beings, right? This whole idea of selfishness. Now, according to some, the assumptions of neo-Darwinism have been disproved, right? Vast majority of scientists still accept it. However, what we got to understand is, it doesn't matter if all of them accept it or they don't accept it as valid. The assumptions are accepted by both sides. Here's how we have to think about Darwinian history and the mechanism. The history is the tree of life. The mechanism is natural selection, as I mentioned earlier. However, if the mechanism breaks, the history breaks. If the road on this bridge breaks, then it doesn't matter if those foundations are there. Imagine that going across this bridge is A to B, how species change, or the tree of life, or whatever evolutionary trajectory. If natural selection breaks, then you cannot say this evolved from that. This is why the conversations need to move away from things that are similar to things transform, and that's based upon the mechanism. And of course, there's disputes about Darwinian theory. This is very hard to deny. There are people who put forward alternatives like evolution by natural genetic engineering, neo-Lamarckian evolution, mutation-driven evolution. These are atheist scientists who are putting this forward, right? And you know, this idea of we worked it out, we worked out the secret of life, we worked out the Darwinian history of life, we know what's going on. You will not find that in academia. When you go there, you'll find a lot of people saying things similar to this. What the evolutionary biologist Michael Rose says, the complexity of biology is comparable to quantum mechanics. This whole idea we worked everything out, it's not like that. We have projects like the Third Way, which is secular evolutionary biologists who do not believe in creationism, do not believe in intelligent design, but they also challenge neo-Darwinism, so they come up with their own. And remember, these people are not challenging universal common ancestry, they're challenging the mechanism, right? So the mechanism is something which is the core of the theory, and that is, of course, something that other scientists also challenge. But like I said, guys, it's not a scientific theory alone. It is more than a scientific theory. Have you ever heard someone say, string theory has made me an intellectually fulfilled atheist? No, but you'll find Dawkins saying the likes of Darwin allowed us to be intellectually fulfilled atheists. Look at this idea of morality and human rights and money and all of these things being absolute fictions because of Darwinian theory, which is I've written a philosopher Yuval Noah Harari, but it's actually the historian Yuval Noah Harari. But anyway, that doesn't make any sense. So clearly it's something that is more than a theory. Oxford University in 2016, they published a book, Darwinism as Religion, written by Michael Roos, who is an atheist and he's a Darwinian expert, and he's the most published author in the world in terms of Darwinism. You will not find anybody who comes as close. Richard Dawkins, in comparison to him, would be a teenager, right? This guy is a heavyweight academic. He's an atheist and a Darwinist, but he admits, alongside of the Darwinian theory, which is scientific, there is something above and beyond that, which is a religion, right? And Darwinism is a religion. It's not just a scientific theory. And some 70, 80 years ago, this handsome gentleman, Julian Huxley, also argued Darwinism is a religion without revelation. And he argued the world has to be evangelized to this new atheistic vision, this religion, this Genesis story of atheism. This evolutionary biologist, this atheist philosopher, Julian Huxley, he wasn't just working out of his mom's basement. He was having a direct influence on world education. He was the founding president of UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. And he used that platform and other platforms to push out his religion without revelation, to push out Darwinism. So it's not just a scientific theory. And you'll find mainstream secular academics saying the same thing. Jerry Fodor, he called Darwinism, so when he called out Darwinism, he was called a secular creationist. Lynn Margulis, you can see she's there with Bill Clinton. She also, again, all of them are atheists. She also considered neo-Darwinism in the future is going to be considered as an Anglo-Saxon sect. Masayoshi Nai, another acclaimed evolutionary biologist, he says Darwin is God and you cannot challenge him, and he tries to argue against Darwinism. All of them recognize this is more than just science. James Shapiro, who I mentioned earlier, again says the same thing. Thomas Nagel, Mind and Cosmos, the book that is published by Oxford University, atheist philosopher, again making the same argument about how it's not based on the evidence alone, how it's a presuppositional thing. All right, just to sort of bring things back to the overall picture, okay? We covered probabilistic framework, assumptions, disputes. Now let's get into this. Darwinism is a product of the scientific method. So whenever we speak about Islam and evolution, we need to keep that in mind. The scientific method has a lesser epistemic weight than the divine revelation. Divine revelation doesn't suffer from probabilistic framework, assumption, disputes. If divine revelation cannot be reconciled with Darwinism, then divine revelation takes precedence over the scientific method in the same way it does with the virgin birth, in the same way it does with the sea parting or any other miracle. Why do atheists find it hard to believe in miracles? Because they don't believe in Allah. That's the fundamental issue. Anyway, there's an interesting quote here from Hamza's book, The Divine Reality. It is also important to note that scientific knowledge and divine revelation have two different sources. One is from the limited human mind, the other is from God. One would have to commit an epistemological disqualification to use scientific conclusions as a means to dismiss revelation. We have a pixelated understanding of reality. Our knowledge is finite. God's knowledge is not. So in summary, Darwinian evolution, like I mentioned, because of the philosophy of science, we can say it's science, we can say it's a valid scientific theory model paradigm, but it doesn't mean it's absolutely true. Why? Because the philosophy of science teaches us science is not the only root of knowledge. Problem of induction, problem of underdetermination, problem of unconceived alternatives, problems of sensations, which I didn't actually mention, and other sort of issues. And ultimately, methodological naturalism entails no separate ancestry, no design, and a naturalistic purpose. And Darwinism itself is based on a probabilistic framework which has assumptions, which has disputes. None of this can be denied by secular academics. Still a valid theory, still the prevailing naturalistic paradigm, and the only naturalistic theory which is there, which is there in place right now because it explains the data better than the other theories of evolution, and it has to be the only conclusion that the scientists stick to, simply because it's the only naturalistic conclusion. It's not just a scientific theory, it's also a secular religion, as Michael Roos points out, and others. And divine revelation takes precedence over scientific method. So if somebody comes and says, and this is why it's very important not to take the Quran and to take science and say, well, maybe this happened, maybe that happened, maybe this particular scenario, maybe that particular scenario, this happened, or no, we just need to be very clear and direct. We simply need to say, do you know what? It doesn't matter if the scientific method, the scientific consensus, and the data is being interpreted in a way to say that the virgin birth is impossible. We will believe in the virgin birth. Likewise, Darwinism, the idea that one human being appeared in the history of life without being linked to other hominids or other chimpanzees or anything else in nature is simply impossible from a scientific perspective. We believe it. We believe Adam, we believe in Eve, we believe in their miraculous creation, and we believe they don't have any forerunners. We don't believe they have any, we believe they are the parents of all of humanity, and that obviously contradicts science. There's no two ways about that. But just because it contradicts science doesn't mean the Quran is wrong. It simply means science, as a limited method with presuppositions, with limits, with fluctuations, it's arrived at a conclusion that's contradicting reality. Because what is reality except what Allah and His Messenger have said? What is it? All forms of knowledge, historical, testimonial, scientific, geographical, all of them are superseded by the Quran and the Sunnah if there is a conflict. Why? Because that is the ultimate truth. Historically, Egyptologists may come together and say, you know what, we were wrong, pharaohs never existed. Say that happens in the future. Doesn't matter, pharaohs existed because the Quran said so. When it comes to Yusuf alayhi salam, they may say, Egyptologists may say, we have no historical account of Joseph, we have no account of the wife who was trying to cheat on her husband. We will say, well, carry on, but we don't believe in you, right? We don't believe in your pixelated view. We have a source of knowledge which supersedes anything that you may try and cover over with, okay? So even 100 years ago, or less than that, 80 years ago, the sun was stationary according to scientists, something we can see, not even a theory, something we can see. The sun was stationary, and Allah says the sun has an orbit. So here you have all the scientists saying the sun is stationary, and you have Allah saying the sun has an orbit. What happened later? We discovered actually the sun does have an orbit around the Milky Way galaxy. However, at the time, we never had that information. So ultimately, why do people find it hard to believe in the Quran or the miracles of the Quran, or when something is said in the Quran like the virgin birth which contradicts science? It's because they don't believe in Allah. So we have to bring people back to the belief in Allah before any of this framework that we're talking about makes sense, which is also why it is superfluous, ridiculous, and it doesn't make sense to argue why Darwinism is false with an atheist until you first show them why we believe in Allah. Which is why when you are talking to an atheist and they bring up evolution, the first thing you need to show is how evolution doesn't undermine the existence of God, right? Or Darwinism rather. All right, so that's basically the summary of this talk. I've gone over time by about 15-20 minutes. Apologies for that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the comments and the questions and try to address those, inshallah. All right. Sidra Alia is asking, I don't know why I'm getting this thought. Can there be any link between the fact that previous nations were punished to become pigs and apes, and now humans believe that humans have been evolved from pigs and apes? I mean, I know those punished people don't exist in the form they currently of currently existing pigs and apes. So Sister Sidra, your question from our paradigm that was given today is a non-question, because your question is assuming science is saying something, the Quran is saying something, let's match them up and see if we can reconcile them. Or if the best thing we could do is simply say the Quran is the truth, science can change, science isn't the be all and end all, and leave it there. We don't need to come up with ways of, oh, maybe this happened, maybe that happened. What does Allah say in the Quran? Do not talk about that which you don't know. Do not talk about that which you don't know. Very simple point. So yes, there may be ways that people may get bright ideas of maybe this happened, maybe that happened, maybe, and Allah knows about, you know, those ideas. But isn't it extremely dangerous to say something without knowledge? Isn't it extremely dangerous theologically, from an Iman point of view, from a future generation's point of view? Doesn't it feed into scientism when we start saying, okay, this is how things can match, this is how things can... The ultimate problem in the world in terms of atheism is scientism. Darwinism is a byproduct of that problem. The ultimate issue is they believe science to be the be all and end all in terms of epistemology and in terms of certainty. We need to show them from an epistemic perspective, science isn't the be all and end all, and from a certain point of view, it's certainly not there to give you certainty. And then when somebody says, all right, let's just say hypothetically this could have happened, that could have happened. No, what we need to do is we need to deal with the elephant in the room, and the bright pink glowing elephant in the room is science. In fact, it's not an elephant. It's a cow. It's a holy cow. Like Bani Israel made up that cow and they started, you know, worshipping it. Yeah, science has become into a holy cow. Right? People worship it, and this is why, you know, if you want to show yourself to be more credible, even if you're a manager, right, you'll say, I studied science, I studied management sciences. Why would you say management sciences? Why don't you just say management? It's a simple reason, because if you add science to anything, it just looks more credible. You know, look at adverts. Yeah, buy this product, and then you get a scientist, you know, sticking up their thumb. Here you go, mate, buy this product. Why? Scientism. What we need to do is that holy cow that's walking around grazing on our carpet, just give it a kick. Nothing wrong with kicking a cow. Okay, disclaimer, like hypothetical platonic cow, it's a cow. Yeah, deal with the cow. Don't feed it. Don't start, you know, giving it more salt and grass and then, you know, sucking on the udders. Forget that. Kick the cow. Scientism's false. Kick the bloody cow. That's what we got to do. We got to get away from this idea that science is the be all and end all, and we should get away with this knee-jerk reaction of let's reconcile. Imagine if we did this 100 years ago. All right, scientists believe the universe is eternal. Okay, so they believe the universe is eternal. Even Einstein, when it came to his general relativity, before the theory, before the idea that the universe is expanding and therefore it's not eternal or all the rest, right? Even he, in terms of general relativity, he incorporated the idea of the universe being eternal. What would we do 100 years ago? Let's see how we can take the verses of the Quran which say the universe has a beginning and interpret them in a way to say the universe doesn't have a beginning. We would look like absolute muppets after the 1940s when it was discovered the universe is not actually eternal. 100 years from now, they may actually go back to saying it's eternal. On top of that, not only would we look like Muppets for changing the word of Allah as science comes and we keep changing it, on top of that, what does it show us about our Iman? That we're willing to change the word of Allah or the interpretation of the word of Allah because of limited human understanding which is in flux? What kind of Iman is that? And ultimately, I mean, day and night, essentially, we're dealing with cases where people are like, okay, here's a scientific argument against God. Here's a scientific argument against the Quran. Here's this. Ultimately, we're dealing with science being used as a baton, and we simply need to show it's a blunt instrument. It's not as heavy as people make it out to be. And all we simply need to do is not misrepresent science. All we need to do is look at the philosophy of science. End of rant. Anyway, Assalamu alaikum. How do biologists explain the emergence of the male and female through a single cell? How did that cell survive and result in the emergence of other species? Through natural selection. That's their story. That's their just so story. They'll come up with elaborate ways on how asexual reproduction led to sexual reproduction. But as I've pointed out, and time to do some shameless plugging on my Darwinian Delusions channel, as I've pointed out, you gotta do what's this thing? Yeah, it's a big problem of trying to explain how asexual reproduction, like bacteria, they don't have sex. Bacteria don't, like, you know, have wedding ceremonies and get married. Yeah, they have asexual reproduction, and bacteria multiplies. Very easy reproductive way of dealing with life. And then you get human beings trying to get married. Yeah, and human beings trying to get married is complex. Like, come on, anybody here from Pakistan, yeah, you would know, how do you get married? Well, you get the groom, you get the wife, and the groom has to be above 6 foot, the wife has to look pretty fair, the groom has to have a 6-figure salary, the wife has to be able to cook and clean and also massage the feet of a mother-in-law at the same time, and blah, 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 blah. You get all of these additional qualifications until people don't get married until they're 49 years old, right? You have all these complexities before you get biological reproduction. However, bacteria simply reproduce. And sorry to be crude, but human beings don't even act like we were designed by natural selection. If we were truly designed by natural selection, we would just be running around having sex. And not just sex from the perspective of, yeah, the way it was done in the 60s. No, from the perspective, people would be actually having kids. And they would simply try to have as many kids as possible, which is the exact opposite of what people actually do. So anyway, in short, the answer is just those stories. Let's look at some other questions. If science doesn't give certainty, how do we use scientific facts like embryonic, what's this? Oh, embryology in the Quran to prove the divinity of the Quran? Well, my friend, you're in for a surprise, right? We have another webinar on science in the Quran and the scientific miracles, and you will see that this approach does not make any sense, right? This idea of scientific miracles in the Quran and science giving us indisputable facts which are never going to change. And also there's another important distinction which I mentioned in my previous presentation. There's a difference between a scientific observation or an observation and a scientific theory. When we're talking about science, we're talking about theoretical frameworks, broad theoretical frameworks there to try and explain one interpretation of the observations. Observations in of themselves are not science. Staring at the stars is not science. You can stare at the stars and come up with astronomy or astrology. Astrology is clearly not science, but it's using observations, okay? So observations in of themselves are not science. So if someone says, if the earth is going around the sun, clearly that science is never going to change. No, mate, that's not science, that's an observation. Okay. Okay. How can we briefly explain that evolution doesn't undermine the existence of God to an atheist? In the same way, you can briefly explain there's no correlation between being a serial killer and stamp collecting. Now, if someone does want to maintain you can be a serial killer and being a stamp collector somehow entices you to being a serial killer, then rather than trying to disprove the link between being a serial killer and stamp collecting, you simply are going to raise an eyebrow, look at them in the eye and say, please, can you briefly explain the link between being a stamp collector and being a serial killer? So there's no point answering a question when they haven't made an argument. Usually the atheists confuse an argument for an assertion or an assertion for an argument, whichever way you want to put it. They confuse the fact that they're supposed to tell us how biological evolution or Darwinism undermines the existence of God, and then we're supposed to give them a reply. They mainly assert it and they assume we're going to refute it, but you can't. What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Salam, thank you. Enjoy. What do you think of Muslim scientists who are arguing for evolution? How would I convince them they are wrong? Okay, so I have come across somebody who, online has videos, and this particular person is a professor in a Middle Eastern university, and she basically says this, right? She tries to say Adam alayhi salam, a'udhu billah, is a metaphor, or there's various sorts of things. The problem with these types of people is that they only know science, they don't know the philosophy of science, and they definitely don't know theology. So with those people is to stop them being so binary, right? And get them to look at the holistic picture. And if they are using their mind objectively, I'm sure they won't come to these conclusions. What do you say to those Muslims who are matching things of Quran and science and trying to match things just to appeal to be logical? The best way of appealing to be logical is by being logical and by simply understanding logically whose testimony is greater than Allah's. And Allah says this in the Quran, whose testimony is greater than Allah's. So don't appear to be logical, be logical and understand there's nothing higher than divine revelation. Okay. So look, some of you guys in the comment section, you're writing down names of people and saying, this person says this. Look, what I would recommend, is you simply don't use people's names, right? You simply say, okay, here's an argument someone's giving. What do you think about this argument? I think that's the best way of dealing with it. And I think this is just generally in the dawah, we should focus on non-Muslims and we shouldn't be name calling and this type of thing. Look, this idea that human beings, we interbred with other hominid species, or we did this, or maybe this happened, or there's a second creation of Adam alayhi salam on earth, or this, all of these ideas, or even like the sister mentioned earlier about pigs and chimps, maybe that's in the Quran because that's what a nation was punished. And they have all these ideas, right? But where do these ideas stem from? They stem from ultimately the idea that we have to reconcile science with the Quran. Where does the idea of reconciliation of science with the Quran come from? That reconciliation comes from the idea that science gives you truth, the Quran gives you truth, therefore we have to reconcile. Is that idea valid? No, because science doesn't give you truth. How can science give you truth? Science is based on methodological naturalism. So automatically, it is making an assumption about the world and what's within the world, which is not provable. Methodological naturalism says there's no God. Can we reconcile the idea of methodological naturalism, which says there's no God, with the idea of the in the Quran that there is a God? No. Ultimately, what we got to understand is there is no point putting up science to the level of the Quran, saying both of them give us truth. There's a misunderstanding in our notion of truth. Let's get in there. No, what we got to do is this. We got to understand science doesn't give you truth, whether you're scientific realist, scientific instrumentalist, empirical, whatever, right? Constructive empiricism, whatever they call it. Science doesn't give you truth. Science based upon the assumption of methodological naturalism and the problem of induction and the problem of determination, problem of unconceived alternatives, problem of sensations. I mean, there's so many ways to slice the onion and explain science isn't the be-all and the end-all. Would we, okay, let's reconcile the virgin birth with science. That's assuming science gives you the truth and the entire picture about biological reproduction. But we as Muslims believe Allah says kun fayakun, He can create a virgin birth, no problem, right? So we need to stop this thing of putting up science to that level. And like I've been saying before, just kick the cow, right? Stop feeding it. Okay, more questions. Very interesting question by Arik Rahman. Assalamu alaikum. I am just paraphrasing. Quran says that if the book is not from God, then there would be many contradictions. So isn't the Quran's challenge to its veracity contingent on external evidences? So can any contradictions with, let's say, historical evidence not bound by induction make it true nonetheless? All right, if I understand your question correctly, you're saying, look, there shouldn't be a contradiction between the Quran and what we know through another evidence, another field, say history or geography or science or whatever. No, not necessarily, because it's possible that the Quran is giving you a picture which a particular discipline is giving you the opposite picture. So is it possible that Egyptologists, they challenge, like I said before, the story of Joseph? They say there was no Joseph, there was no king, there was no famine. The Quran mentions a famine. There was no famine. All of our Egyptian knowledge and the language we've uncovered, we have all of the history of ancient Egypt, and there's not a single year except that they had a bumper harvest and every harvest was better than the other. The Quran says that there was a famine, and the famine 7 years, or I think it was 7 years, right? And at the time, then they had to store, and then they had to do this. So all the Egyptologists can say something. What would we as Muslims say? We would say those Egyptologists who are reading the ancient Egyptian language, we can simply say those people who wrote down there was no famine all that time, they either didn't know about the famine, there was some lost history, or they're simply lying. We're not going to take the word of Egyptologists when they say, well, they don't say this, but say if they said there was no famine. Why? Because Allah, there's no one's testimony is greater than Allah. Allah has said there was a famine, so there's a famine. Eventually we will find evidence. Why? Because as Ibn Taymiyyah said, there is no contradiction between, in short, revelation and reason. The contradiction is, actually no, I'm going to take back that quote because it's a long time since I spoke about this and I listened to it, so I don't want to say something that's wrong. Long story short, if there looks like there's a contradiction, we're not going to say we've missed, no, the Quran's wrong because it's disagreeing with something else. No, we're going to say the Quran's true, and we'll eventually find out what's wrong or what data we're missing. Okay, let's stick to one last question. Question about morality, that's not really the topic. Thank you so much. How can we support your work? Thank you, Peter, for that question. You can simply go to Sapience Institute and support the Institute, support the work. You've got people like Muhammad Hijab, Hamza, Imran Hussain, myself, Dr. Uthman Latif, Adnan Rashid, Yusuf Ponders, Jamie Turner, great guys who are working for the sake of Allah. So all the help and support and everything is more than welcome. So let's end it there. Alhamdulillah, it was a good session. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening attentively and asking questions and putting up with this very long and difficult topic. It is difficult, I have to admit, but inshallah, hopefully the way I've broken it down, you guys can understand it a lot better. Everything good I have said is from Allah. Every mistake is from myself. Jazakallah khair for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.